The king called me a contract on our wedding night, and I believed him until the moment he shattered a man's jaw for making me smile. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and this story deserves to be told from the beginning, from the cold morning my father sold me to save himself. I was 19 when the royal guard came to our estate, their black horses cutting through the autumn fog like omens made flesh. My father had gambled everything we had against the crown and lost, and I stood in the doorway watching him sign the papers that would make me a queen in name and a prisoner in truth. He did not look at me. He never could after my mother died and left him with a daughter who had her eyes, her stubborn chin, her way of seeing through his excuses to the weakness beneath. The journey to Valdrin took 3 days through forests that grew darker with each mile. I remember pressing my hand to the carriage window, watching the last of the golden leaves fall like tears the trees were too proud to keep. The air grew colder as we climbed into the mountains, and I pulled my thin cloak tighter, wondering if I would ever feel warm again. The castle rose from the mist on the third morning like something out of a nightmare, all gray stone and sharp towers clawing at a sky the color of bruises. I understood then that I was not entering a fairy tale. I was entering a tomb. King Alaric waited at the altar with the patience of a man signing trade agreements. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across a face carved from winter itself. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, and when they met mine, I saw nothing. No curiosity, no cruelty, not even disappointment. Just absence, vast and cold as the mountains that surrounded his kingdom. He spoke his vows like reciting inventory, each word precise and empty, and when the priest declared us bound before the old gods and the new, he turned away before I could even draw breath. The banquet that followed was a blur of faces I would never remember and wine I could not taste. I sat beside him at the high table, close enough that our sleeves nearly touched, yet separated by miles of silence. The candles flickered, casting shadows that danced like mocking spirits, and I kept my eyes on my untouched plate. It was Lord Brennan, his silver-haired advisor, who finally asked the question everyone was thinking. He gestured to me with his goblet and said something about the king's new bride, about how lovely she looked in her white gown, about what plans His Majesty had for the marriage. Alaric did not even glance in my direction. His voice carried across the hall, flat and final as a coffin lid closing. She is just a contract, nothing more. Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and cutting, and I learned in that moment how to make my face a mask, how to swallow shame and let it settle cold in my chest. They gave me the East Wing, a series of cold rooms far from the king's chambers, far from the heart of the castle where warmth still flickered. The servants called it the Widow's Wing, though no one would tell me why. I spent my first weeks there learning the geography of my exile, mapping the hallways that led to locked doors, the windows that overlooked nothing but fog and distant mountains. I ate alone at a table meant for 12. I walked alone through corridors where my footsteps echoed like accusations. I became so skilled at invisibility that sometimes I wondered if I had turned to glass, if I would shatter at the slightest touch and no one would notice the pieces. It was the loneliness that drove me to the gardens. They called them the Winter Gardens, though they bloomed in defiance of every season, protected by ancient walls that held the cold at bay, through some old magic no one remembered anymore. I found them by accident one sleepless night, following a path I had never noticed through a gate I could have sworn was not there before. When I stepped through the rusted iron, I thought I had wandered into a dream. White roses climbed the weathered stones, their petals luminous in the moonlight, their fragrance sweet and impossible in the frozen air. A pond lay still as black glass, reflecting stars I had not seen since leaving home. Ancient oaks spread their branches like protective arms, and the silence here was different, not empty but full, pregnant with secrets and old power. And there, at the edge of the darkness where the cultivated garden surrendered to wild forest, 2 amber eyes watched me from the shadows, I should have been afraid. The wolf was massive, larger than any natural creature, its fur the color of fresh snow, its gaze holding an intelligence that felt almost human. But fear had become a luxury I could no longer afford, and something in those ancient eyes spoke not of hunger, but of recognition, as if this creature had been waiting for me. I sat on the cold stone bench by the frozen pond, and the wolf emerged from the trees, moving with a grace that made no sound against the frost-kissed grass. It lay down at my feet like a guardian taking its post, and for the first time since my wedding night, I did not feel alone. I returned every night after that. The wolf was always waiting, patient as moonlight, its breath making clouds in the winter air that mingled with my own. I began to speak to it the way I could speak to no one else, my voice barely above a whisper. I told it about my mother, who had taught me to read the stars before the fever took her, who had sung me to sleep with songs about wolves who guarded the spirits of the worthy. I told it about my father, who had loved me once, before grief turned him hollow. I told it about the king who looked through me like I was made of air, and how sometimes I wished I were, so the ache of being unwanted would finally stop. The wolf listened with patience older than the mountains, and when I wept, it pressed its great head against my knee until the tears subsided. Winter deepened, frosting the windows and turning the castle into a fortress of ice. My life settled into a rhythm of absence. I saw Alaric only at formal dinners, where he sat at the opposite end of a table that stretched like a chasm between us. He never spoke my name, never acknowledged that I existed beyond the occasional glance that might have been directed at anyone, at no one. The court whispered about his cruelty, about the contract bride he kept like a forgotten debt, but I had stopped listening. I had the gardens. I had the wolf. I had learned that survival was its own small victory, even when survival felt like slowly drowning in silk. Then Lord Kalen arrived, and everything I had carefully constructed began to unravel. He came as an emissary from the Eastern Kingdom, a diplomat tasked with negotiating timber rights or trade routes. What I understood was the way he looked at me the first time we met, in the great hall where I had become furniture. He bowed low, lower than protocol demanded, and when he rose, his eyes found mine and stayed there with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Your Majesty," he said, and the words sounded different in his mouth, like something worth being, like I was not a contract, but a queen, a woman, a person deserving of acknowledgement. Kalen was everything Alaric was not. Where the king was silence, Kalen was warmth that spread through a room like sunlight through clouds. Where Alaric looked through me, Kalen looked at me, truly looked, as if I were a book he wanted to read slowly, savoring every page. He had kind eyes, the color of honey in sunlight, and a smile that made the cold halls feel almost bearable, almost like home. He asked me questions no one had thought to ask in all my months of exile. What did I read when the nights grew long? What did I dream about when sleep finally came? What made me laugh before I forgot how, before this castle stole my joy along with my freedom? I should have been more careful. I knew the court watched everything, knew that whispers traveled faster than winter wind through these stone corridors. But Kalen made me feel human again, and I was so hungry for that feeling that I stopped counting the cost. We walked together through the castle grounds, our breath making clouds in the frozen air. We sat together in the library, heads bent over maps of places I would never see, and he told me about his homeland, about the sea that stretched endless to the horizon, about the freedom of standing on a cliff with nothing but sky above and wild water below. He made me believe, even for a moment, that freedom was still possible. One evening, he found me in the winter gardens. I had not told him about this sacred place, had guarded it like a secret, like the last corner of my heart that remained truly mine. But he had followed the moonlight and found me sitting by the frozen pond, the white wolf at my feet like a spirit guardian made flesh. I expected him to be afraid, to back away from the beast that watched him with those knowing amber eyes. Instead, he knelt in the snow and extended his hand, and the wolf sniffed it once, considered, then settled back against my legs in silent acceptance. "He has been keeping you company," Kaelin said softly. "Someone should." And then he sat beside me on the cold bench, close enough that I could smell pine and sea salt. And for a single perfect moment, I forgot I was a prisoner. I did not notice Alaric watching from the shadows of the garden gate. I did not see the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, the way his jaw tightened as Kaelin leaned close to brush a snowflake from my hair. I only knew that something had shifted when I returned to the castle and found the king waiting in my chambers. A darkness in his frozen eyes I had never seen before. "Where were you?" His voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse, like the stillness before a storm. I told him the truth, that I had been walking in the gardens, that I had lost track of time beneath the stars. He crossed the room in 3 strides and caught my chin in his hand, forcing me to meet his gaze, and I saw the ice in his eyes beginning to crack. With him. It was not a question. I felt my heart beating against my ribs like a trapped bird, and for the first time since our wedding, I saw something other than emptiness in those winter eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but heat. The kind that burns. "He is an emissary," I said carefully, keeping my voice steady. "We were only talking." Alaric's grip tightened, just enough to leave the ghost of a bruise. "You are my wife," he said, and the word was a brand, a claim. "You do not belong to him." He released me and left without another word, and I stood there trembling in the dying firelight, trying to understand what had just happened. The king, who had ignored me for months, who had called me a contract before the entire court, was suddenly claiming ownership of something he had sworn he did not want. And the terrible truth was that some part of me, some small and broken part, felt something other than fear at his touch. The days that followed were a war of silences and glances. Alaric began appearing at dinners, sitting closer than before, his presence a weight I could not ignore. He did not speak to me, but he watched. Always watched. His eyes followed me across crowded rooms, tracked my movements through the halls. When Kaelin approached me in the great hall, the king materialized at my side like a shadow gaining form, his jaw set, his hands clenched. When I laughed at something the emissary said, I felt Alaric's attention sharpen like a blade being drawn. Kaelin noticed too. He pulled me aside one afternoon, his kind face creased with worry. "He is different around you now," he said, keeping his voice low. "I see the way he looks at you, the way he looks at me. This is becoming dangerous." I knew he was right. I knew I should step back, become invisible again. But I was so tired of being nothing, and Kaelin made me feel like something worth protecting. I told him I could handle the king. I told him lies we both wanted to believe. The breaking came on a night of falling snow. There was a feast to celebrate some treaty I had already forgotten, and the great hall glittered with candles and crystal. I wore a gown of deep blue velvet that a servant had laid out without explanation, and when I entered, I saw Alaric's eyes widen for just a moment before the mask returned. He had chosen it. The king had chosen my gown, had thought of me, had wanted to see me draped in the color of midnight and winter seas. Kaelin asked me to dance. It was innocent, just 2 people moving through the ancient steps of a waltz while the court looked on. But his hand was warm on my waist, steadying and kind, and he leaned close to whisper something that made me smile. And across the room, I heard a goblet shatter against stone. Alaric stood at the high table, wine spreading at his feet like blood, his face carved from ice and fury. The music stopped, the dancers froze, and the king crossed the hall with a purpose that made grown men step aside. "You forget yourself." He was speaking to Kaelin, but his eyes never left my face, burning into me. The emissary released me and stepped back. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect to you or your queen." Alaric's smile was a knife. You meant exactly that. And before anyone could move, his fist connected with Kaelin's jaw, a crack that echoed through the silent hall like the sound of everything changing. I screamed something, and then the king's hand closed around my wrist and he was dragging me from the room, through corridors I did not recognize. We reached a chamber where the fire burned too hot and the shadow stretched too long, and he released me like touching me had burned him. You would shame me. His voice was shaking. You would make me a fool in my own court, with my own wife. I pressed my back against the stone wall, my heart hammering. I have done nothing wrong, I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. You do not want me. You have made that painfully clear from the moment you spoke those words at our wedding feast. You do not get to decide what other men I may speak to. Something in his face cracked, and what spilled through was not what I expected. I do not want you. He laughed, but it was a broken sound. I have wanted you from the moment you walked down that aisle, looking at me like I was your executioner. I have wanted you every night. I have lain awake knowing you were so close but forbidden to me by my own cowardice. I called you a contract because I could not call you what you are. Because I do not deserve to say the words that have burned in my throat since I first saw your face. I stared at him, trying to reconcile this bleeding confession with the man who had ignored me for months. Then why? I whispered. Why treat me like nothing if I meant something? Why let me suffer alone in that wing of ghosts while you pretended I did not exist? Because my father married for love, he said quietly, and it destroyed him, destroyed this kingdom. He loved my mother so completely that when she died, he could not rule, could not think, could not live. He wasted away and left me a kingdom on the verge of collapse. I swore I would never be that weak. I swore I would keep you at a distance, keep myself safe from the ruin that comes with wanting someone more than reason allows. He looked at me then, and his eyes were not frozen anymore. They were burning. And then you smiled at him, and I understood that distance means nothing. I am already ruined. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we had never said. I thought of Kaelin, kind and safe, and offering me escape from this gilded prison. I thought of the white wolf waiting in the winter gardens, the only creature who had seen me truly since I arrived. And I thought of this man before me, this king who had hurt me with his absence, and was now offering something terrifying in its honesty. I did not choose to be here, I said finally. You took everything from me, my home, my freedom, my future. You do not get to claim me now just because you have finally decided to feel. I know. His voice was rough. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I am asking anyway. Not for the contract, not for the crown, for the chance to become someone worthy of you, to learn what it means to be a husband instead of a warden. I know I have given you no reason to trust me. I am asking for the chance to give you reasons. I should have refused. Every rational part of me screamed to walk away, to find Kaelin, to escape this cage while the door stood open. But there was something in Alaric's eyes that reminded me of the wolf, that same ancient understanding, that same patient waiting for something lost to finally find its way home. And I realized that I was not the only one who had been lonely in this castle. I was not the only one who had been taught that love was weakness and walls were safety. Show me, I said. Not words, not promises. Show me who you can become. The months that followed were not easy. Trust does not rebuild in a day, and there were mornings I woke convinced I had made a terrible mistake. Mornings when Alaric's old coldness flickered across his face, and I felt the ice returning. But he tried. He dismissed the advisors who had encouraged his cruelty. He moved me from the widow's wing to chambers near his own, rooms filled with light and flowers and windows that overlooked the winter gardens. He sat with me at meals and asked about my day, awkward as a boy at his first dance. And slowly, so slowly, I began to see the man beneath the crown. The boy who had lost his mother too young. The prince who had been taught that feeling was failure. The king who was learning day by day to let the ice thaw. Kalen returned to his homeland when spring began its slow awakening. I will not pretend there was no grief in watching him go, this man who had been kind to me when kindness was rare. Part of me would always wonder about the life we might have had, the sea salt mornings and cliff-edge freedoms he had described with such longing. But wonder is not the same as wanting. And when I stood at the castle gates and watched his carriage disappear into the morning mist, I felt not loss but release. The dream of escape had kept me alive through the darkest months, but I did not need to escape anymore. I had found something worth staying for. The white wolf still meets me in the winter gardens. Some nights Alaric comes with me, and we sit together on the cold stone bench while the creature watches us with those amber eyes that seem to hold the wisdom of ages. My husband does not fully understand the bond I share with the wolf, but he does not question it. He has learned that there are mysteries in this world worth respecting, connections that transcend the rational mind. And when the wolf presses its great head against my knee, I see something like gratitude in Alaric's face. Gratitude for this guardian who kept me whole during the months he was too afraid to love me. I am no longer a contract. I am no longer invisible. I am a queen who chose to stay, not because I had no other options, but because I saw something worth fighting for in the broken man who finally learned to see me. And on quiet nights, when the snow falls soft outside our window and the fire burns low, Alaric takes my hand and tells me that I saved him from the ice he had built around his heart. But the truth is simpler and more complicated than salvation. We saved each other. We chose each other. And that, in the end, is what makes a marriage real. The wolf howls sometimes, a sound that carries across the frozen gardens and through our chamber walls. Alaric says it sounds like mourning, but I know better now. It sounds like blessing. Like a spirit of the old woods acknowledging that its work is done, that the lonely girl who wept in the moonlight has finally found her way home. I press my hand to the frosted window, watching the white shape move through silver-touched trees, and I whisper my thanks to the creature who taught me that survival was not enough, that I deserve to be seen, that even the coldest king can learn to love, if only someone is brave enough to wait for the thaw. This is my story. Not the one I expected, not the one I would have chosen, but the one that became mine. And if there is a lesson in it, perhaps it is this: that contracts can become promises, that prisons can become homes, that the heart we guard most fiercely is sometimes the heart most desperate to be known. I was sold as a debt. I stayed as a choice. And every morning I wake in this castle that was once my tomb. I know that I am exactly where I was always meant to be. The winter gardens bloom eternal, and the white wolf watches, and I am no longer invisible. I am queen. I am loved. I am home.